Well, the Star Wars movies obviously set the tone for Star Wars and established some of the most important parts of the lore of the universe. The backbone of Star Wars lore, especially when it was first getting started as an expanded universe, was actually an unexpected source, with only a very small percentage of fans actually engaging directly with it. But it still had a huge impact on the more popular forms of media. I am talking, of course, about RPG sourcebooks. This isn't just the idea that role-playing game sourcebooks changed lore forever by establishing who Luke Skywalker's second cousin was or something like that. The RPG sourcebooks were where the names of species like the Twi'lek and Quarren were first published, things that are used in almost every project even today. And according to Tim Veekhoven on the Star Wars website, this is even where some of the original trilogy characters like Pondo Baba and Mama Nadon got their names to first show up too. Some of these things would have existed in notes before that were pulled together by the RPG sourcebooks, but even just being the first place something is published is a pretty big deal, especially at that time, where information was less directly accessible to people without things like Wikipedia and the internet in general. When you wanted a Star Wars fix, you had far more limited opportunities to get that. The Star Wars role-playing game was first published by West End Games in 1987. Having beaten out TSR, the creators of Dungeons & Dragons, for the Star Wars license. Basically, on top of the direct rules of the game, tabletop RPG sourcebooks exist to set out examples of things within the narrative universe that you can use. In the case of Star Wars, this would include planets you can play on and visit, characters you can meet, ships to fly and fight against, and even example adventures to go on, helping whomever is running the game, the dungeon master or game master, to guide players through an adventure. So expanding the content of the universe beyond the movies was necessary to be successful here, so everyone's not just doing their own Death Star destruction, even though I'm sure a lot of people did that as well. Which is why they become such a treasure trove of Star Wars lore. The more there is to work with, the more successful the RPG can be. Some books, like the Galaxy Guides within the Star Wars RPG, exist almost exclusively for that extra world-building information, rather than really focusing on the game element at all. So on top of people who would be getting these books for the purpose of playing the RPG, there'd also be other Star Wars fans who just want to learn more about Star Wars lore, something they can easily do today by liking this video and subscribing for more. Ultimately, Wizards of the Coast would buy TSR and then ended up holding the Star Wars license for a second iteration of the Star Wars role-playing game published in 2000. So if you ever hear someone talking about the Star Wars D6 system, that means they're using a 6-sided die, and that was published by West End Games originally, and then if it's the D20 Star Wars RPG, that means they're using a 20-sided die, and that is the Wizards of the Coast version from later on. There's actually been a third Star Wars tabletop game system, the Fantasy Flight Games version, that uses an entirely different set of narrative dice, and that's actually my favorite one. That's one I've played the most, at least, even though it's been a few years since the latest sourcebook for that has been published. But again, when the RPG was first released in the late 80s, if you were a Star Wars fan, there weren't many other ways to find that universe-expanding lore. The Marvel comics existed, but while some elements of those were worked into future Legends books, like the Dark Lady Lumaya, who goes on to be the Sith teacher of Han and Leia's son Jason, and there were characters and species like Jackson of the Lepi who were brought forward into modern canon as well, the Marvel comics weren't foundational to the expanded universe as it would later develop in the same way as RPG sourcebooks would end up being. Instead, the Marvel comics tended to get added into broader continuity in a kind of sideways way. Stuff would certainly be integrated, but these had also largely finished publication by the time the RPG started. Some novels also did exist already, like Splinter the Mind's Eye, and some adventures of Han and Lando, but the idea of a consistent Star Wars universe with tied-together media, especially from different mediums, didn't really exist yet. Most things that were published were seen as fairly standalone under the Star Wars brand. This isn't an idea which changed overnight, instead being a slow process of greater integration and cooperation over decades, leading to more modern periods where a character can show up in a book, comic, game, and a TV show within a few short years. But when Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn was published in 1991, it was a major step in that direction, and the existence of the Star Wars RPG books was a big reason that was possible. There was initially the idea that Star Wars books, starting with Heir to the Empire, would be a yearly major event, building on each other more and more. Although the one per year major event wouldn't turn out to be true, the novels became a lot more interconnected with each other. And while Tim Zahn balked at the idea, the hope was that the novels could also tie into the Dark Empire comic series being made by Dark Horse. The solution to his hesitance there was simply setting the Thrawn trilogy before the Dark Empire comics rather than after. But while he may have been able to sidestep working with Dark Empire, the RPG juggernaut could not be so easily avoided. Zahn had been asked to write a new Star Wars book which would become heir in November of 1989, but in July 1990 he was requested to work with West End Games to integrate some of the world building done there into his books, basically helping flesh out the background of what the Star Wars universe would look like in the Thrawn trilogy. According to Zahn, quote, "Once again I set off wandering around the house, this time growling and grumping. Here I was 11 chapters into the book and suddenly there was more research to be done. Finally, I cooled down and started actually reading through the material. And you know what? The stuff was pretty darn good." By the time he was sent the books in July of 1990, there would have been around 25 RPG books to pull from, and while Zahn was certainly going to add his own twists, many of the things he'd be working with came from the RPG sourcebooks. On top of Galaxy Guide for Alien Races being able to provide some other species for him to throw in, another title, the Imperial Sourcebook, provided background information on the Empire, some of its characters, and the origin of several vessels which would heavily be used throughout Zahn's work and beyond, like the now iconic Dreadnought heavy cruiser, which played heavily into the Thrawn trilogy as the old vessel behind the mysterious Katana fleet in Dark Force Rising, before also featuring in almost every other Star Wars book, several games, and even making its way into canon by showing up in a TV show, Star Wars Rebels, with an altered design. And this is a relationship which continued to go in both directions. The RPG sourcebooks would continue to be an invaluable resource for authors looking to ground their individual novels with established and connected parts of the existing universe, be that ships, characters, planets, or other simpler details. And I think this is especially noteworthy at a time before the Holocron Continuity Database or the Story Group existed as a readily available resource, which has often been mistaken for a governing board, but that's a different video topic. Many books were written either very quickly or even simultaneously, and the idea that there was a group you could go to or even a person you could go to who knew everything wasn't quite so established. A lot of the heavy lifting there was done by Sue Rastoni, who was the executive editor at Lucas Licensing, but her work is made all the more impressive just by how difficult it would be to manage everything at that point when a lot of these tools didn't exist. So having the RPG sourcebooks as a thing that authors could pull directly from if they needed to know the name of a planet or something they could use was a lot easier than having Sue or someone in Sue's position run around and do all that work for everyone at the same time. But like I said, this was a relationship which went in both directions, so authors would often work with West End Games throughout the 90s to adapt their new material into the RPG. That earlier quote from Zahn was from his own foreword to the Thrawn Trilogy sourcebook, an RPG sourcebook under West End Games, which expanded on the backgrounds of the characters from the Thrawn Trilogy novels in ways that the books focusing on the major narrative just aren't built to. And this happened with several other works, especially earlier on, like the Dark Empire sourcebook, Truce of Bakura's sourcebook, and Kraken's Threat Dossier for the Black Fleet Crisis, Corellian Trilogy, and Courtship of Princess Leia. But just for an example of how much your perception, if you watch a lot of Star Wars lore videos, might be influenced by RPG information, much of the information we have on things like the Imperial Warlords and the way the galaxy developed after Endor may have been shaped by the narrative novels, but they essentially took place in a more amorphous galaxy, with the RPG sourcebooks coming in and giving them more of the shape we know today. For example, the Pentastar alignment may be something you're aware of as a major Imperial power after Endor, but while it was first defined in a 1994 RPG sourcebook, it not only appeared 0 times in any novels, I don't think it was even mentioned once in a single Star Wars book at any point. Whenever I do other lore videos, I'm often asked what book should I read to learn more about this, but in a lot of cases the answer is just that there was not a book about whatever it is that we're talking about. Instead, it's a collection of different references from different sourcebooks. As time went on, RPG sourcebooks continued to come out, but they were supplemented with lore sourcebooks like the Essential Atlas and Essential Guide to Warfare, which existed alongside RPG sourcebooks to fill the obvious hunger for more of this background information that could tie together parts of the universe the books would never realistically be able to get to, or to attempt to smooth out some of the many inconsistencies which arose from having so many people working on so many of their own little corners of the universe. But as another part of that back and forth with authors, with the need within the RPG games to add little side stories and information to flesh out the universe, authors of major Star Wars novels like Timothy Zahn, Michael Stackpole of the X-Wing series, and Kathy Tyers of Trucit Bakura were often brought in to write short stories, sometimes relating to some of their characters. The Star Wars adventure journals are full of these stories by names you may recognize as still working within Star Wars today, like the authors I've already mentioned, Pablo Hidalgo and Patricia Jackson, who returned to Star Wars short story writing with an entry in 2023's Return of the Jedi edition of From a Certain Point of View, a book which brings together short stories for side characters within the movies. This came 26 years after her last entry for Star Wars in the West End Games adventure journals. I'd argue that these short stories and the success of the RPG ecosystem, simply from a lore perspective, showed the hunger for that kind of information about the Star Wars universe, and demonstrated just how popular that kind of book, along with the Essential Guide series, could be on their own, let alone the cottage industry of Star Wars lore YouTubers which has sprung up around it. Some of you may also know that on top of doing these lore videos, I also helped develop the Empire at War expanded mods like Thrawn's Revenge and Fall of the Republic for Star Wars Empire at War. And I can tell you that this kind of background lore provided by these books is a big reason that my lore videos, the lore videos of other people, and the mods that I or other people work on are even possible in the first place. That's going to do it for today though. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Special thanks to the patrons who you're seeing scroll by right now and who make this channel possible. You can join them by clicking on the link in the description to learn more.